Perfect. So today we are going to be covering an intro to servers and APIs. And so let's see, what do we have in store? So as far as learning objectives go, so we sort of outline this here. We're going to review clients and servers, their relationships, and how requests and responses work. So we've been working with some of that through the course, and I think you guys have seen that with mockAPI. So we're going to look at that again a little bit. We're also going to talk about APIs. So you've also worked with APIs, like for instance, the Open Weather app. That's an example of one API, and we'll look at that like just visually as well. Again, just looking at mockAPI, but now sort of looking at like why we had you use mockAPI, so the advantages, but also looking at disadvantages. Why are we learning about servers? Um, how mockAPI is sort of like a server, but we don't have as much control over it that we might want, and why we're actually going to make our own servers. So looking at sort of the reasons why we're doing that. So that's also pretty important that we're going to cover. Uh, so as I said, why we want to learn about servers as well as making our own. So that's one thing we're going to cover. So the server and API concepts in the Notes app. So we've used the Notes app as this sort of model scenario for an app. So you can just like, you can write notes, you click a button, and it's sort of added to a list of notes. And we have like a little mini code, and I can show of that Notes app. Um, and so looking at the server and API concepts in that app. And so this will be go into more detail. So that's also something that will be covered. And then looking at REST. So REST is it's an extension on VS Code. So I'll show how to install that and how to get that working. And it'll come in handy later as like as a means to test things. So there's that. So we have already been working with clients and servers for the last little while, but it's always good to do a bit of review. So right now we have our client. Let's just imagine it there. And we can think of the client as usually it's our browser. Um, like if you're browsing a website, the client is just your browser. The website's going to be the server. So let's introduce the server, which is the website. Another good way to think of it would be, if you're on a React app and you're trying to do something, the client is the actual app that is running locally. And so that's like where our code is and the actual things that we see that we can interact with. And sometimes usually the server, it is, again, the website or where the website is actually getting its data from to show you. So it might be some physical location that's quite far away that stores that data and sends it back with the requests. And as we can see here, so this guy is the client is sending a request to the server. And in this case, we have, so HTTP is a protocol used to send requests, and that's that's almost everything I'm going to mention when it comes to HTTP. But as you can see here, we have like get, post, put, delete. So these are just examples of types of requests that we could send. And these sort of, get, post, put, delete, these specify what sort of changes we want to happen with data. So let's think of a real world example that can make this more concrete. And so a real world example could be YouTube. So imagine like you're logging into YouTube, and I know this is not really what the login looks like on YouTube, but I thought it looked, the designs look nice, so I put that there. And imagine that you're writing your username and your password, and then you hit login. So when you hit login here, it's sending data to YouTube servers. So that's YouTube servers there, and on their end, on their servers, they're connected to some database where they store all your user account information. So your username, your password, as well as like other stuff about your account. So what they'll do is they will receive that request that you send from your client. They receive it on their end at their servers, and they perform some sort of cross-checking. So they will check that, okay, for this username, is this password correct? And then if it is correct, they'll send back all that sort of user information. So we're making a post request there where we send some data. And then if that is successful, then they send back our account info. So maybe our name, our full name, how many subscribers we might have, the videos that we've liked, our playlists, stuff like that. So again, this is like a really quick review, but it's something we've seen before and worked with, and it's always good just to do a bit of a recap on that there. Does anyone have any questions about like anything on this slide? You know, you can raise your hand and ask. You can ask in the chat, or you can raise your hand and ask. You know, unmute and ask as well. Okay, awesome. Awesome. All right, so let's see. So next we have, so let's talk about APIs. And we're just going to be reviewing the concept. So this thing here, that's called open weather. Actually, let me go back because there's something I want to mention. Examples later. Absolutely. Yeah, this is just like a really high level, like just pictures and sort of models, but I'll show code pretty soon, and we can go into details in the code, and I'll like draw out things, and so that will be covered as well. Yeah. So let's talk a bit about APIs. So APIs sort of build off of our understanding of servers. I would say the best way to think of an API is as a means to an end. So um, APIs will let us interact with a server, typically to request data or perform some operation without having to worry about how the server internally handles that. All we need to do is send a correct request, and then we can trust that we will get the data we want based on what we are sending. So a good analogy would be that if a server is a building with some parcel is waiting for us at that building, the API is the address that we need to find the right door to knock on, sending a request, to get the parcel handed to us, which is the response. So we're going to talk a little bit about open weather map here. That's an API for current weather data. So all we need to do to get that current weather data is just send this request. So we want to make this call. Now, you notice this kind of looks like a web address, but this is basically an API address, or endpoint address is another term we can use. And we sort of send a request to this address to sort of get access to open weather map data. So what we would need to do is, so as you can see, we have like this API openweathermap.org. So that's like the server address, and then it's saying, okay, data 2.5 weather. So I think this bit is it sort of tells it that we want the current weather, because there are open weather map has a lot of different services, and the current weather is like the free service where you can just make an account to do that. And so yeah, we need to have our latitude. So this bit here, we would put a number there. And then this bit here, again, we put a number there, so latitude, longitude. And then this app ID, so API key, we would put some key that is given to us. So we can go over this later as well. But when you make an account on Open Weather Map, for those who have done the API assignment, they probably do remember that you would go into your account settings and it would give you like a little key, and then like you would have to copy and paste that into every request you made, just so it can verify that, okay, like this is someone who has an account with us. And so I went and did this. So yeah, so we send a GET request. So I actually did this earlier, and then my response was this. So I live in Vancouver. So I did this a few days ago, and as typical, it's cloudy. So this was the response I got. Now I got a much larger response with the more data, but I'm just showing just this bit. But as you can see, we sort of get this what's called a JSON object. So there's that. Yeah, does anyone have any questions? I mean, this is just sort of a very high level overview, but we can later go over. I would say if there's anything you want to go over in a lot more detail, do write it down, because today, the afternoon lecture is just a recap of what we're covering this morning. So if you want to see more coded examples of that, do let us know, and I'll make sure to. Okay, that's okay. Don't worry. We'll go over more examples. I think maybe once you see the code, I think that'll be good. We're gonna see the code later today, and like within like 30 minutes, and also very shortly as well, in the afternoon as well. Perfect. Okay. But I guess more importantly, though, is the analogy of using an address here, sending it. So let's say just using this address, and if I can send it to Open Weather, and then I can get my current data. Now, I will go over an example using actually, why don't I do that right now? So let's actually do this right now. Why not? So, oops. Oh, it even saved it for me. Okay. So I'm using something called Postman to send requests to addresses. So this is, as you can see, it's the same thing I put there, but now I have a location for latitude and longitude, and that is my API key. So let's see. I'm going to send it right now. Let's see what I get. Okay, so right now it is cloudy as well. It is. Now, if I look outside, it's cloudy. So I'm going to change this to some like random coordinate so we can see that if it makes sense. So let's do latitude 0 and longitude 15. Now, where is that exactly? Oh, it's the North Pole. Yes, it does look like it. Okay. So maybe it's going to be snowing. I don't know. Well, but it is different. Like, notice that it's something different. Wrong latitude. Okay, wait. Maybe more clouds. Let's just see. I just want to. Okay, well, that's also wrong. It's a fun tool to play with just to see. So let's see. What's the let's just put Tokyo or the city. So it's cloudy in a lot of places. Okay, maybe I'm typing these in wrong. Absolutely, yeah. Postman can be used to check between client and server as well, and we're going to be using it to do that. Great question. I'll actually introduce a better tool for that, even for like just the open weather thingy too. I'll introduce a better tool that is just put it in the chat, but I'll introduce a new tool very shortly that can do it much faster and it's like less, you don't need to download something separate really. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about mockAPI. I just have a quick recap on that. So in many of assignments, as well as the React project that we've been working on, we've introduced mockAPI. So mockAPI is really just a server, and put it here. So this is an example. This was a previous project we were working with. But mockAPI is really kind of like just a server. And the endpoint we use is related to the resource you want to interact with. It even has its own database built in. So, notice these numbers here. So let me actually annotate this. So this is the server address. Now notice that this bit here, let me make that, decrease that width. So this bit here, notice like this. So this is our secret key. But essentially, this whole thing is the server address up to this point. Now, this is something called the endpoint. So if we have puns, if you send something request to puns, the request will be like, okay, you want me to interact with this data here. If I put feedback, let me use a different color. If I put feedback, again, the same address, but I just put feedback, then it wants me to interact with this data, or I want to interact with that data. Now, I mentioned that they have a database, so I'm just going to define that as storage for data. That's it. Kind of like a warehouse stores, a bunch of Amazon things. Database stores a bunch of data, digital data. And so here, notice like we have 8 and 3. So we have 8 puns and we have 3 of something called feedback. So if I remember correctly, this was just for handling user feedback. So it's just like messages that users send. So we have 3 of those. That really is about it for that. And yeah, so the bit that I highlighted in green, that is like the address. So just to solidify this concept, I'll ask a few questions. So the first question I'll ask is, actually, maybe I need to, there we go. Yeah, so these are just resources again. Mention it there. So, one thing I'm going to talk about is, so I'm going to ask few questions. And the first question I'm going to ask is, what URL, and so URL is like the address. So hint, hint, this address. And HTTP request type. Okay, so request type, again, we just saw that in the old slide. We have get, we have put, and again, this is a recap of stuff we've already learned. We have post, we have delete. Okay, so from these choices and from the information here, what would we need to send and where? Like what sort of request would we send to get all the puns? So that'll be the first question. Perfect. Yes. So we send a GET request to the puns resource. And what is the puns, like what is the address of that request though? Where is that GET request going to be sent? Like in terms of like HTTPS / like the full link, like the full URL. I'm gonna, well, maybe I'll just highlight a few things. I'm just gonna be like, in pink, we have that, maybe we have that, maybe we have this. So, which of those, I guess. Okay, perfect. So I see that. Excellent. Okay, so we have an answer in the chat. So it's just going to be, uh, again, HTTPS, and then we have the API key, .mockAPI.io slash, and then the resource. So that's great. Now, what about, so let me, now we have our, so this is the answer. So we would send the GET request to this address here in bold. Okay, perfect. So, okay, next question. What URL and request type would we use to send feedback? So now we're not getting puns. Now we want to send feedback. So we want to update that feedback data. And also, is there any data we might need to send? Depending on the request type now we have chosen. Perfect. Okay. So I see it in the chat. Okay, so it is a post request. That is correct. And so post request would be sent to this address, but we also need to send the actual feedback data. So with that request, we would send a data object. And that data object would sort of just be put into the feedback. So that from 3, it would go to 4. So let me just put that there. Here, we would go from 3 to 4. That's good. Okay, I'm going to clear that just because I'm going to go, well, maybe it auto clears on the next slide. Oh, no, it doesn't. Okay. Just clear that. Okay, perfect. So let's talk about some of the advantages. So we'll discuss in detail why we use mockAPI, what advantages its usage sort of gave us, and we can elaborate on that and take up any questions. So one thing was that mockAPI let us manage a server and database without much complexity. I will mention that when we say database, we just mean digital data. Anything that's stored basically digitally. So information that was stored digitally in a one place. And all we needed to worry about were just basically these things. So the nature of our data, so schema, how many fields it has. So what I mean by this is really just, remember when we were having discussions on making mockAPI, and we were thinking about, okay, what sort of data do we need to store? And you might remember that when you created a new resource, when you click this button, create new resource on mockAPI, it gave you an option where you could choose what fields to put in your data. So ID was by default there, but then you could name fields and you can give them types. So for instance, maybe if I want to store information about people, I had name, and you could like give the next field the name, and then the type string, and then maybe the other one is password. Maybe this is like some login thing, and that was all, could also be string, right? So that's what I mean by one thing that we have to worry about, because we have to decide what sort of data are we storing, what are the fields in these objects, or if we're storing objects. In these cases, it's string. Maybe there's some extra data, more data here for a person. That's an object. So that's like going to be another curly bracket thingy there. So we have that. And then sending the right request to the endpoints depending on what we want to do. So if we want to add new data, post request with the data sent into that endpoint, updating data, put request, deleting data, delete request, kind of like that. So that was one more like sort of thing we had to worry about. But we didn't need to worry about the internal workings. So that's good. It really simplified that. And what I mean by that is like how the request we send is going to be translated into updating the data stored on the server and then the response that the server sends back. So let me do this here. So when you did, let's say remember when we were using Axios and we did something like axios.get and we put our URL here. And then remember how we did something like .then, and then it's like, okay, data, do something with our data. Or if we get an error, do something with our error, right? Now, typically we decided, okay, if we're here, we get the data properly, right? So we do everything in our app. Like this sort of stuff at this level is like what we're doing, what our app is doing, what we're seeing. But here's the thing. When we sent the request to the server, how does the server decide whether it succeeds or it fails the request that we send? So there's something internally happening on server side for mockAPI. When we send a request, it is looking at like what we're sending and what endpoint we're sending it to, and it's deciding if this is like successful or not, and then also what to send back to us to tell us if it's successful or not. Like for a GET request, it's like, okay, this is a GET request, so I need to send back the data. So this is what I mean by internal working. We don't need to worry about like how to do that. We just send the request and we get it back. And that's actually why it's called mock API, because again, it's like we just need to know we just need to send the right request, the right address, and the right information. The internal working is sort of hidden, just like how it is in an API, just like the open weather thing. It's hidden in the same way. Open weather, we didn't have to worry about like how we're getting that weather data, how it's being collected, how internally it's processing that request we send. We just need to worry about sending the right request. So there's that. So that's pretty key. Okay. Let's see. Right. So when we like a pun, so that's an example for like puns. Let's say you like one. We don't need to worry about. Okay, so it's just another example of how we don't need to worry about what's happening internally on the side of mockAPI. And that is an advantage, certainly. And I think there was exactly, yeah. So there's a little diagram here. So in this case, our app is sending a put request to the puns endpoint from before, and we're sending a new pun. So essentially, this is like an example for, let's say each pun gives you the option, like there's a service and there's a bunch of puns you see, right? And there's like a like button, and when you click a like button, it updates the likes count by 1. And so, but to actually do that, we need to send a put request because we are updating an existing data resource. We're updating an existing pun. It's like count by 1. So we send that request to mockAPI. We get the response, but here's the thing. The internal updates and state is hidden. We don't need to worry about how it does it. So this is just another like a visual of this sort of advantage. Okay. Does anyone have any questions about that? Okay, perfect. Again, I will show a coded example of this very shortly. Okay. talk about disadvantages. So remember earlier how I said we don't have control over internal workings? Now that is an advantage, but it's also actually a disadvantage. Um, so again, yes, not much complexity, but it's actually a disadvantage as well as being an advantage. Now, the disadvantages part of it is that it deprives us of the ability to write our own custom code that does work between the time a request is sent and the response is received, or I guess a better term than received would be the response is sent back. So that's a good example. No, you don't need to download mockAPI. So it's an online service. So on some of the assignments, I think we'll give more detail on how to set it up. It is like it's just a website. There's no downloading. Okay, so there are cases where we do need to write our custom code. So when we make our own servers, we're going to be making our own custom sort of, I guess you can call it that, our own custom mock API. So this will be our custom server. We'll have some way to internally represent data, probably just a variable that stores it. And we'll see more examples of this. We'll run the server at some address so the client can send requests to the server. Just like remember how mock API had that like address with the key and all that? We'll be using localhost to do it, but again, it's sort of the same thing. It will have an address, so that's important. We will write code for endpoints, kind of like how we had the puns and the feedback endpoint. We will also have endpoints so that we can receive requests, handle them with custom logic, and send responses back to the client. Again, this is just like very high level. Today's lecture is not on endpoints or building that. That's tomorrow we'll be going into much more detail on doing it. This is just like a brief overview of what we're going to be doing over the next week. Um, but I guess the most important question to ask is why bother, right? So when our app gets more complicated, this actually becomes necessary. Exactly. That's an excellent question. Why do we bother with this? We're not, so I will say we're not building mock API. We're building a server basically that does the same thing. So I'm just calling it, it's like our custom mock API because I'm just using sort of what we've seen as a familiar thing to call it that because it does accomplish the same things and more. So the reason why it's important is because when our app gets more complicated, it's actually necessary. So I'll give an example here. So let's say that our app has the ability to log in. So you can actually log in with a username and a password, right? Now, in between the request being sent, the username and the password, right? Like you send a post request with your username and password, and the response being returned back to the sender that this has succeeded or not, we need to do some work internally to check if that's correct. Now, we can't do that with mock API. I'm not sure, maybe we can. I will ask that as a question. That does this sound like something, given like how you guys have worked with mock API, does this sound like something we could do with mock API where we can send a request and before we receive the response, can we verify that that username and password is actually correct? Just based on like the request we send and like right at the time the response comes back, basically. Right, so I see a question here for, I'm just looking here. Oh wait, whoops, I think I liked the wrong one. So here, yeah, so we don't need to worry about it on mockAPI, but we do need to worry about it when we make our own servers. Now, I'm saying it's not actually a custom mockAPI, it's a server. I'm just calling it a custom mockAPI because it's visually very similar to how mockAPI works, but it's a bit different, but I'm just using terms that sort of that are more familiar to us that we've already used. But it is different. It's not the same thing. Yeah. Okay. Now maybe I'll let that we can come back on that in the afternoon. Is this something that mockAPI could do? This point here about if we send a login and a password, could mockAPI actually do that? That's something to look into. Um, it actually, I'll just say that it can't. Yeah, we can't do that with mockAPI. So technically, okay, we can do that, but we would need to send multiple requests, and we would need to have like more processing happening within our own code, like on the front end. We cannot just send a request to an endpoint and expect the response to say that, okay, authentication error or something like that, given how mockAPI works. Um, we could send a there is some like I think maybe I covered this in an earlier lecture. There is other stuff we can do to sort of simulate that sort of thing, but it involves multiple requests being sent and a lot more operations happening on our front end that are like checking. Um, but yeah. Okay, so we will go over more reasons why we are using a. So I will actually maybe that'll be a question you can think about. Uh, and I think it's a good question. This one here, and the slides are posted, so I'll let this right here is essentially the reason why we can't do it using mockAPI. Exactly. Yeah. So Navita, that's a great point. So if we did try to do it using mockAPI, basically this bit here, we would need to do a lot of other things outside of just a single request. We would need to send multiple requests and do a bunch of checks. And we could not just do it by sending a request and getting the response back that says successful login or authentication error. We would have to do a lot more to simulate that. And maybe we can talk about that. Let me write that down actually. Simulating login with mockAPI versus a server. So just highlighting that. I'll mention that in the afternoon. Okay, but let us continue. Right, so now let's talk about our notes app. So this is mockAPI version. Okay, so I actually wrote a little bit of code here. And one sec, there's one thing I'm going to do. I think what I'll do first, I'm gonna go to the next slide first. And so this is gonna be a visual to, yeah, so we'll go to that shortly, but I'm just gonna show you a visual of what it sort of actually looks like the whole thing when we're running a notes app that is interacting with a mockAPI server, what it looks like. And then I will show the code for that, but I've also linked um, the code here. So that's the repo. But I think first I'll show this because I think this is pretty important. So this is our browser. Okay, so that's the first thing. Our browser is running our React app. Now the app itself, now you might notice this, like when you click that run start or run dev or that little command, it says that the React is running at localhost 3000 or some localhost. And when you go to that on the web page, you see the React app, right? So there's that. The key point is that the React app, it just takes the JavaScript code we have and it just like puts it on the browser. So there's that. And okay, so let's continue here. Now this bit here, this cylinder is just our local code. So that is just what we have in VS Code at that point in time. We have app.js, index.js, right? So these are just the files that have our components and like, you know, all that sort of stuff. That's like why we are seeing that, the app, right? So it's taking this code and it's putting that on the browser, okay? So now in terms of mockAPI, so now we have our mockAPI server. So remember, this is just the address that we're interacting with. I've just put endpoint here just to simulate any endpoint really. So that mockAPI server internally keeps track of our data. Okay, so that's important. Any request that's sent, we update data, they're sent to the endpoints that exist on this server. So that's the connection that we make. And we actually make this from here. And I will show that in the code as well. And then we get responses back based on what we send. Usually populating our app with notes. And I'll show the code very shortly. And yeah, I mentioned here, mockAPI probably has its own database to store our data. And then I put another little line here because it might be confusing, but I put this line connecting these two because we can actually put this server address into the browser and access the data. So it's by default a GET request, okay? Okay, so I'll leave this on the, let me actually take a screenshot and I'll send this in the chat. So we have that on the side. Everybody can have that open. Oops. When we look at the coded example. Okay, so this is our coded example. I'm going to go, this is Notes app version 1. So let's go to module 5. That I want to run it. Version 1, let's run that. Install all the packages first. Okay, so now it's running. And let us, it was running at 5173. So let's just do that. So we have our code in one place. Okay, so that's really just our notes. I can send, here's another note. I can click send, it gets added. Here's the thing though, so this is pretty important. How it's adding it, again, it's a very straightforward from what we've seen before in Notes app. I'm using state to keep track of things. One thing, okay, so this is how, I think one thing I will go over in more detail, how we're connecting to mockAPI. So again, I'm importing something called Note Service. You'll notice that to get the notes, I do get notes, and then I set the state to the response. When I'm sending a note, I also use Note Service, and I send the data. And okay, so I only have those two implemented. Now, the Note Service comes from this file. And you can see here, that's the address of the mockAPI. So when I send the GET request, it's that address /notes. I do the send, it's this address slash notes, and we can actually see here, oops, API. This is basically the project. And these are the same notes that I have there because I'm connected to this mock API. So these are the same notes where I'm getting them from. Okay, so, oh yeah, I did mention you can actually put this. It's in a different directory. You can notice that here I'm importing it from services slash notes. So I'm just importing this file, but I'm calling it note service. And this file is exporting multiple functions. So I'm just doing like note service dot get notes or dot send notes. Okay, so there's that. Okay, I will mention for some of the new people who maybe are on like a previous module, don't worry too much if you don't understand like these concepts because these are like recorded lectures. You can always come back to them in the future. And some of the things I'm talking about right now are building on concepts we've learned previously. Actually, all of it is building on stuff that we have learned from like the ground up previously. So I will just mention that. So don't be like discouraged if you don't understand this like right away. That's totally fine. A lot of the previous content sort of builds up to this. Okay. What was I going to? Oh yeah, so I was going to show going to this, right? Because I mentioned you can just do this. Yeah, so we can actually go directly to this web address. So that's why I had that line there on the diagram. So there's that. Now I'll go more into detail. Does anyone have any questions about Notes app version 1 here? Anything like I can go into more detail about it, how this is working. But it's just like a pretty standard React app. I haven't actually even made components really. I'm just using the this app component. You can see here this is actually like what we're seeing, and this component is just this one here. And I guess for a refresher, it is grabbing from this. So this essentially everything that we're seeing is just an HTML file. Like eventually it's all turns into HTML. It's all converted into that. But what we're doing here when we're creating a root, so document, when we're doing this like get element by ID, we're grabbing this element and we're injecting our app into the child of this. So we can see that here visually. If I go into elements, it's inside this root that I can now click and we'll see all the notes and all this stuff here. Exactly, yeah, I'm using Vite, so it's JSX instead of JS. So I think JSX gives us a little bit more, what would I call it? It's JavaScript XML. So it gives more control over, it's escaping me right now exactly what it helps us with. But essentially, we can write JavaScript code, but we can directly put HTML and these sorts of elements quite easily just into it directly. Because these divs and things of this sort. Okay, so let me check where we are in our slides. Okay. So in that case, I'm going to close just these ones. So let's actually, okay, so let's take a 5 minute break. And then when we come back, we can continue. And I think also we'll talk more about APIs as well. So and take up any more questions that have come up. I think yeah, so let's take a 5 minute break. And then when we come back, we'll talk about, I think like what we'll talk about next, we'll address a lot of these questions on like, what are we using to make this server? So I will say now, like, let's probably better not, would have probably been better if I did not call it a custom mock API, but a server instead. So we're going to be making our own server and with its own endpoints, all of that. And very shortly, when we come back from our 5 minute break, we're going to be talking about what tools we're going to use to do this and what it looks like. So I will show, now we'll go into more about like, so building the actual thing is tomorrow, but we'll talk more about like visually with a diagram like this, what it looks like. Okay, so we'll be back very shortly. Let's take 5 minutes. And so at 9:10, let's come back and sort of come back to these concepts. Okay, so we're back and we just had our break. So let us continue with some of the concepts that we have been talking about. So as I mentioned, a lot of you have some, great questions on like, what are we using to build this server? So we're going to be using something called Express. And again, so this is version 2 of the Notes app. So version 1 was using mockAPI that we really sort of, I guess we quickly went over it, but we will, we can go over it in more detail as well. Version 2 is, which I will spend more time on, is using Express. And so I have a link to the code. It's in the slides. I will show the code as well. I'll show how to actually run it because it's a bit more involved. But I think before we get to that, we're going to first talk about like, again, the visual model of what it looks like, what's different. And then like, we'll have that as a reference while we look at the code in more detail and we'll be able to identify like these parts. And I think seeing a visual representation of what it looks like is helpful in understanding. So let's do that. So this is, so what we see here, this is unchanged. So the React app still runs on localhost 3000. So that's not changed. We still have our browser that actually is displaying that app that's running. Our local code looks the same, app.js, index.js. So again, the app.js is for the component app, and then index.js basically like starts it by injecting that app component into an HTML file. And the file is actually what is sort of put on the browser that we see, that HTML file. Okay, so so one more thing is that, so what's changed is now we're using a Node and Express. We're using Node and Express, or basically Express is running on Node to make our server. So we'll go into this in more detail about how to make these endpoints, how to get this running from the ground up. Today we're going to look at an example that's already sort of been made and just try to identify these sort of moving parts and see like, okay, how does that work? Right, so any requests we want are sent to endpoints that exist on our server. So remember, mockAPI also had endpoints. We just didn't have control over them. So now we do, because we can create endpoints. So now we have a lot more control over this. And then again, based on what we send, we get a response back. Okay. Now, the actual address typically of this, and I'll just put it here, it's not just localhost 3001. It's usually going to be localhost. This is just a convention. 3001 slash. Here we'll put some extra stuff. So if we're working with notes and we want to send it to, if we have some sort of internal representation of notes and we want to get those notes, let's say, maybe that is a good name for an address where like this is the endpoint. Sometimes people put a little bit more complicated thing. They'll write something like /API/notes. So then this becomes the endpoint. But again, there's just the core thing is that we have control over what we want it to be. So that is essential. Okay. Ooh, and this is one more thing. So another difference is that we actually have a server.js file. And remember, when I mentioned these endpoints, all of that exists here. At least in the first example we're going to look at, it's a very simple implementation. So the endpoints are here, and we're going to talk about what that looks like. And I will actually compare that to mockAPI. The endpoints are there. Our server, the start is there, like the startup for the server. Getting it to actually run at this address, it's all in this one file here, which is also in our code. So that's important. Okay. Perfect. Okay, so let's look at this in more detail. So I'm gonna, again, take a screenshot of this and I'll send it in the chat. And then we can, let's just send that to the chat. Yes, we can have many endpoints. So let's look at an example. So remember when our mock API, oh, let me, okay. Now we're working on version 2, and notice, this is interesting, notice that we have a client and a server. So we have two separate things that are running. Okay, so let's make another bash, and I'm gonna call this, just make that green, and let's make this blue. And I'm even gonna like name these differently. I'm just changing the ad, like where, I'm just like trying to find where these are. Sure, examples, notes, version 2, server. Okay. Just make sure I have installed all the packages. Looks like I have. Let's start. So one thing, okay, so I'm gonna run this client first. This is just the front end. So remember, from that visual, this is like the left-hand side of that image that I sent in the chat, basically. So one issue, we don't see any notes. And that's actually because the server is not running. Remember, we are connected to a server. And let's actually look at what that looks, let's see what that looks like. The code is actually incredibly similar. Like all this stuff is the same. The only thing I changed on the front end was this services file. Notice here that now my URL is this address. It's not mockAPI. It's localhost 3001/API. Okay. Now technically this is not actually necessary, having the /API. I just have it there. I could just have it just be just that. It could be that. What's important is making things consistent between where I send like what address I use here, and then the endpoint in this server. So first we're going to look at this. So this is the left-hand side of the image, or the left, right? So this is actually our, well, it's not app and it's not index, but it's just the address that we're sending it to, our request to. And so it could be a different address. Yeah, like I could make it 5,000 as long as I'm running the server on that port. Yes, so this is HTTP. So I remember when I was writing this code, I was getting some errors, like things were not working because I typed HTTPS. And I think the S is secure, or it stands for encryption, but I cannot run like my own local server that also has the S, like it also has the encryption working. So it's just HTTP, so no data is encrypted. It's not secure, but again, everything is just being run locally, so it's not really that big of an issue. Yeah. And as you can see, it's really the same. It's just this address has changed. Now, okay, so now let's run our server. Okay, so it says server. So server is start running on port 3001. So now if I refresh this, I get this stuff here. Okay. Yes. So let me show why typing that ran. So if I go into server in package.json here in scripts, run dev. So dev is actually executing a command, nodemon server.json. So we can run, it's nodemon is kind of like node, but one thing is when you run node, if you do this, when you run in node, any changes you make and save, you have to actually like cancel the server. Like you have to like control C, cancel the what's running, and then rerun it. If you're using Node, if you're using NodeMon and you make a change, it just reruns this thing without having to manually do that. So that's just the benefit of that. Yeah. Remember, so notice that I'm running two things. I'm running, so again, this is not 3000. This is 5173 because of Vite, but it's really not that's not the key thing. The key thing is that I'm running two things. I have a client that's running the left-hand side, like that green box, and I have a server that's running. Excellent question. Where is the data stored? So note that I only have one file in this server, server.js. So let's really quickly look at this. And again, the core of this will be covered tomorrow on like how do we write this from scratch. That'll be covered tomorrow. But today we're just going to be look very high level how these things compare. So these are my notes. So this is actually the starting point. Yeah, so we have the client and the server. Both of these directories are inside version 2, okay? So, and this code is also available just to look at. This here, I have this like kind of starts it. So here, and then this bit here this code here starts the server. That's key. And notice that these, and we only have 2 endpoints right now for getting and posting. Notice that, so these are the ones we create. And then notice that when I mentioned that the most important thing is being consistent. Consistency is key. Localhost 3001 /API/notes for a get, right? Because it's taking that, putting that in there. Here it's /API/notes. /API/notes. Now, the localhost part is not necessary to write because it's sort of known, it's understood that we are running it on, well, we're running it locally on this port. So it's running on localhost 3001 already. So we just need to specify the rest of it. Okay. Now we'll go into, I'm not really going to cover details of how to write these requests because again, that is tomorrow. But the key point I want to make is just to show, I just want to show it very high level. And one more thing I want to show that's important is notice when we go here, notice this, these are endpoints. This is an endpoint. These are also, and so mockAPI also has these same endpoints. Now, okay, they have more because I just have get and post. They have get by ID, put, and they have delete. I haven't implemented those. But I have these two. But here's the thing, notice that I can't do anything inside of this. Like there's nothing else I can do. I just I just know the endpoint, but I can't do anything inside here. Whereas here, I'm writing code about how to handle the request and then the response back. Okay, so that's the key. That is actually why I made this, just so we can see that visually, how they're similar and how they're different, before we really get into building it from scratch. Exactly, yeah. In the client, we write the front end part. In the server, we write the back end part. Now, all of this will be more, we'll see over the week. This will be like, we'll understand it more. I think for the next few lectures, we're just focusing on the server. Like we're not even worrying about the client. And you might be thinking, okay, whoa, like how will we interact with this? How will we even interact with the server without the client to, send these messages, to write these things, right? So it's a great question. Well, you're probably thinking of that. So let me show you guys a really good tool for sending requests. Okay, so I think I'll have to write it here. So the tool is called REST Client. So in VS Code, you just type in REST Client. And by Huachuao Mao, so you just click that and then you click install. So I've already installed it. But once you have this, you can use this to send requests. Now, it will work as long as the server is running, okay? So here, let me just add a new requests folder. And I'm going to so this is actually how we will send a request. So let's just say get notes. Now you need to make files to like write them in. So I'll just do gets note. It's dot, the extension is dot rest. Okay? That's key. And so let's actually write a request. Do get, I think you need to do that, and you need to type in the address. Localhost 3001/API/notes. That's pretty much it. And then remember, this is running. We click send. Even says received request. That's awesome. Now later we'll go into why I'm able to have that, but that's not the point. That's not right now. And notice when I click send, oh, awesome. Like now I have the response. So I can do this. I can literally just do this here inside of this. Like how neat is that? I don't need to use Postman. I can just inside of here, I can just make a .rest and get these. I could send a post request as well. It would just be, so actually, let's try that. Create new note. I think that would be notes. I think I need to specify content type. Let's do that. Okay. And then what was let's just, sorry, I just need to see here. Content. Okay, the name of that is content. I would say content, or maybe here, content. This is a new note. All right, so let's send this. And okay, here's a question. So I have my front end running here. If I send the request using this, what do you guys think is going to change here? What's going to change here? Yeah. Like on the right side of my screen, what is going to change when I hit send here? Or what should change ideally? Provided there's no bugs or anything. Excellent. Okay, so that is correct. And the reason why that should happen is because I have my server running, right? And remember, based on the diagram that I shared, my front end is connected to this through that services. So it is sending every time a change, like it is sending a GET request to update. But actually, here's the thing. I think this will be different. Remember when we click send here in the code in app.js, when we click send note and we get the response back, so when we click this like handle click send for this button, the send button, we call a function called sync notes, which updates state eventually because it sends a get request and gets a response and sets note. So it updates a state, which causes a re-render. But so if we use this as a tool, so I am using the form and I hit send, this will re-render and change the state because I'm using something that updates state here. Now I'm thinking, if I send this request here, it will not actually change until I force it to re-render by like refreshing it. So let's see. Uh-oh. Header name must have a valid. Sorry, one sec. Let me just. Okay. I'm just gonna, maybe I made some like slight error. Oh yeah, I think I needed a space there. I am now using rest to send. Right, that's for a later lecture. No, we don't need to change the state here. I'm just mentioning that this is, if we send it here, okay, so we get a response. So it has been added. But notice that this state on the front side doesn't re-render. Now that's normal. Like we shouldn't expect it to, because when we send it here, we update. When we send it there, we're updating. We're calling a function here in this .then of the send that sets the local state and triggers the re-render when we click this button. But when we send a request using this, it doesn't actually do that. It's just sending a request to the server. The server is updated, but it hasn't been done through the client. So I mean, it's not right or wrong. It's just a different way of doing it. But I'm just saying that like if you do test something and want to see a change here, it's not actually going to, we won't see the change here. We would need to refresh this. And now notice I see that change there. That's just one thing I wanted to mention. I think in that diagram, I also have, oh, well, I didn't put it, but you can actually do this. And notice how now, like, I'm just going to the address of the address of my server. And by default, when I do that in the web page, it's a GET request. So let me try one more. We should see this now. Let's send this. Oh, we still won't see it. We'll need to refresh. Okay. Anyway, that just sort of like a side note, just to mention that. And let me actually, I will, oh yeah, one other thing. You don't want to probably make a bunch of files for each request, right? So you can just put this, you can use this hash, and then now you have like, you can send multiple. So now we're getting them there. I don't know if it's possible to do that, to make it appear without a refresh. It's not really, it shouldn't be an issue though. You can just, right. So actually, so the reason why I brought up the this REST client is actually because sometimes we only, and what we're going to do over this week is we're only going to be building backend, like the server. And so we won't have the front end of that server where like the user gets to use buttons and these sorts of things to interact with data, to update things in the server. We won't have that. We'll just be using requests to do it. And so that's why I brought up this like REST client and how we can use it to accomplish that. Normally, no. So normally it like it is testing purposes or for development purposes, yes. We typically would not get clients to do like, by client, I mean like customers or like anybody who's interacting with the software. That's, they have like that user interface that lets them sort of interact with the server. Although, you know, something like Open Weather, that is like a tool where I don't know if they have a user interface that can sort of like do that. They might, but something like the Open Weather API, that's a use case where the customer has to use something like this to do it. And I did mention, let me actually, let's actually try that. Let's try using this to send like a weather.rest. Okay. So I'm just going to copy the Postman request into, I'm going to use this REST client and see, can it do it? Oops. Get. And okay, let's send that. Oh, so that, oh, awesome. So you can actually use this, I think for pretty much anything, you can use this REST client. As long as you have the right information there, you don't really need to use Postman. You can just do it in VS Code. And this is the response I got. There is that. And let me just commit some of this stuff. And let's just say doing some requests to server during lecture. Let's push those to main. All right, does anyone have any questions? Because I think we are I think that's about it, but we do have extra time. I can cover a few more things. I think yeah, so that was what I just showed, like the last slide was is the REST client, which was something I was just showing. Right. That's a great question. Okay, so let's look at that. So I won't do it in code, but typically what will happen is that um, where we have this server.js, here we would typically connect to a database. And then that would change our endpoints. Like notice when we were looking at the endpoints, well, I won't go into that. I don't want to show the code because again, that is tomorrow's lecture. So I'm not going to go into detail on how we write it, how we like wrote those endpoints and how we're actually grabbing data and sending it back. That's for tomorrow. But I can visually sort of describe it that we have an endpoint here and we have a request coming through and maybe the request is sure, like it's caught here. You catch it. It's a GET request. And so maybe locally in server.js, we have some local variable and we send that back. So that is, we have like a local variable. So that's good. That's the scenario that we are working with right now. But you're asking about what about like a database, right? So it's the same scenario, but what is different is that we don't actually have a local variable. So now what we have is that we have some way to connect to a database and we have some way to essentially grab data from that database. We grab the notes in the GET request and we send those notes back. So essentially, all it is another connection here to the database. And usually we use a cylinder to represent the database or any type of sort of storage. So that is sort of where databases would come in, but we will go more into that next week. Yeah. Databases just sort of build on top of this concept. Actually, let me show you guys one thing and maybe I'll ask a question. Okay, so not in, so we will in a future project, we will be using databases, but not for this one, or I guess for I guess I'm thinking now of like an assignment that we have on upcoming at the end of this week. So there won't be any database for that. That's just going to be a very straightforward setting up a backend server. Okay, so one thing, I'm actually going to do something here and then you'll notice. So I'm going to do something and then I'll be asking you guys in the chat to tell me, why might this have happened and why might this be a reason why we would want a database or like a justification for it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close the server and I'm going to rerun the server. And let's see what just happened. So I lost a bunch of data. So just using what we just saw, can you think of a reason why we might actually in future want to work with like a database? Right. So my question was, when I closed my server and reran it, notice how I lost a bunch of notes? And so we're not using a database, we're using a local variable right now. And so based on what you saw that happened, can you think of a reason why we might want to use a database in the future for storage of information, given what just happened? I canceled the server and suddenly when I restart it, I lose like all my notes. They're gone. Exactly, right. So we would have a database that sort of stores all any notes that we have. And so when we start the server again, it is basically getting it from there. Um, when we used mock API, remember like even if because this is sort of probably this is running on some server and they probably have some like database storage of the information that's in these endpoints. They're probably using a database. Like they have a server and they have a database. Like even if we can't interact with this, this is what I meant that mock API gives us some functionality of a server and a database. The only downside is that we can't really customize endpoints in the way that we might want to for a more complicated project. Okay, awesome. More or less, I would say we have covered just about all the topics that we wanted to cover today. So I think that's great. Um, I guess I'll ask, does anyone have any questions, like sort of overall? Maybe I can just exit that. And then questions about like maybe this diagram and anything about like how what we did in mock API might compare to Express, or maybe even using REST clients, advantages, disadvantages of that. Um, for sure, yeah. So tomorrow tomorrow we'll see in more detail what like I guess yeah, tomorrow's lecture, even though we're not covering databases, when the code will be shown for how to write endpoints from scratch, um, we'll be using local variables, but I'm sure when that code is shown, then we can like really see the analogy can be made for like how we were connecting to a database. Actually, I can draw it here. So the thing is, let me actually, oops, let me go to the next slide. So when we're working with a database, it's like here at this level, we probably have, so we have something called an endpoint. And let's say it's for get, right? So the get endpoint is a box. And this box receives a request. Now, how it's working right now is that we have a local variable that stores an array of notes, right? And that local variable is essentially what is being returned in a GET request. So we get our notes. When we have a database, in this server.js file, we make a connection to a database. Like there are different hosting services. And when that connection's made, we can essentially grab it from the database. Usually it's in that way. And then when we get it back, so this is inside of a GET request, like inside of the endpoint that handles a GET request. So in between the time that we receive a request and send back a response, we're doing all this extra stuff to grab the notes from a database, not from a local variable that exists in the file. So that is how we would sort of integrate database into this. We'll see like the code again. The code for that will be shown later, and I would say it's okay if like you don't quite sort of grasp it now because this is like something we're going to cover next week. I just it might be helpful like just to sort of have this drawing here. But yeah, this is something we'll cover next week. I just thought I would show that clearing the server, maybe to provide like justification as to why we're going to do it. Yeah, in the future. But yeah, great question. I'm just looking through the chat for any other questions. You know, I just noticed that actually pretty interesting. So if I make a slideshow here, okay, those are my speaker notes, but I can do this like audience tools. Let's just see. Maybe we can test this out. I just noticed this. So apparently, I mean, I know like we have a chat, but it's just interesting. Like there's a Google Slides also has this thing. Like I know we have a chat box as well, but interesting. I can also see questions here as well. So there's that. Anyway, does anyone have any other questions? We have like we do have some more time until our lab. If not, we can go on a break for like 10 minutes and then we can start. Oh, really? Okay. Uh-oh. Whoops. Oh, it says, okay, wait. Okay, I'll have to look into that to fix that. Sorry about that. Yeah, any like I guess we have the Zoom chat, so you can ask the questions here as for now until we get that working. For sure, yeah. So today, the lab time today, it's like starts in technically 10 minutes. Although we'll take a 10-minute break and then we'll start at 10:05. So let me I will pause the recording because our lecture has ended.